Right, good morning ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Thai Talk with Dan. Now, would you take your father to Thailand to mix around with those Thai girls? Well, this guy did, and he's got a very unique story to share. So without further ado, let's jump into today's Thailand story. This is a simple story about a man who, from my early childhood, was always very firm but loving. He was a hard worker who came from humble beginnings, growing up during the World War in southern Italy, in the province of Catanzaro. He was born in 1909 and had a sister and 4 brothers. He was the baby of the family. They were poor, and he often told me stories about not having shoes or warm clothes during winter when it snowed. That probably explains his shoe fetish later in life, along with his love for colourful clothing. He said his father died when he was 7, and he didn't remember much about him. He never really spoke about him either. At 16, he left Italy and migrated to Melbourne. He eventually passed away at 86, having spent 70 years in Australia, leaving me a legacy I still appreciate to this day and will pass on to my 3 sons. From what I remember of my childhood, he was a loving father, but he had a temper and was a strict disciplinarian, sometimes a bit too strict in my opinion, but I made it through my teenage years fairly unscathed. He was always determined to instill one thing in me: son, always mix with people better than yourself. That was his catchphrase. Now, fast forward to around 1984. My father asked if I would accompany him on an overseas trip, as he felt he was getting a bit too old to travel alone. Obviously, I said yes. He was around 75 at the time. Back then, I thought that was ancient. Funny how that number doesn't seem quite as old anymore. We headed off with our first stop being Hong Kong. We had a nice time, bought shoes, of course, ate well, had a few laughs, nothing too unusual. Now this is where I'll explain something I still do to this day. I always carry a small roll of packaging tape in my checked luggage when I travel. Why? Because at Hong Kong airport, while checking in for our flight to Taiwan, my dad, being impatient as usual, completely destroyed the zipper on his suitcase. His belongings spilled all over the check-in floor. Thankfully, Cathay Pacific came to the rescue with some packaging tape and wrapped his suitcase like a birthday present so I could survive the next flight. If you remember Carl Malden from the streets of San Francisco, he used to say in those old ads, "Never leave home without your American Express card." Well, I say, never leave home without tape. So, we arrived in Taiwan and spent a few days exploring. I was lucky, as a local representative from the pharmaceutical company I worked for showed us around. At one point, we even had to park under an overpass during an air raid drill. Taiwan was always on alert, and still is. We were well looked after in both Hong Kong and Taiwan by company representatives. Now, enough of the warm-up. Let's move on to Thailand, where the story really begins. We arrived in Bangkok, staying at the Old Indra Regent Hotel in Pratunam. Bangkok was very different back then. I'd been there several times since 1975 and thought I knew the place reasonably well. That assumption didn't age well. We shared a room, which turned out to be a massive mistake. My dad had clearly decided this trip was going to be his last hurrah. He'd been to Thailand before with my mum, but now I realise he must have been on his best behaviour back then. This time, not so much. He was coming back to the room at all hours, roaming around like a dog on heat. I never knew where he was, and I'd have to pretend to be asleep when he stumbled back in during the early hours. That's when I decided something had to change. At our next stop, I made a rule. Separate rooms, separate floors, opposite ends of the hotel. Perfect plan, or so I thought. We arrived in Chiang Mai, and I secretly arranged everything at the Chang Inn so we'd be nowhere near each other. I was looking forward to some peace, but it didn't happen. Every morning around 11 a.m, I'd look out the window before calling him for breakfast, only to see him already leaving the hotel, jumping into a pedicab, heading out on what was very clearly a mission. Yes, he was on the hunt. He'd return hours later, somehow always avoiding being seen entering the hotel, and we'd meet later at the markets. He even made friends with an American couple, which gave me a bit of breathing space. I had completely misjudged him. This wasn't a frail old man. This was a full-blown alpha male charging through life like he had something to prove, and apparently he did. Then came night 3. Around 7:30 p.m, there was a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole. It was my dad. We were supposed to meet downstairs at 7:45, so I assumed he'd changed plans. Wrong again. I opened the door and he stood there with a smirk. "Son, I'd like you to meet a friend I met today." He went on to explain that she had just given him a bath and a massage, but he was a bit too old and worn out to do her justice, so he thought I might like to help her with her English. Right, that's one way of putting it. She was, in fairness, lovely, and that was that. From that point on, I occasionally inherited his leftovers, which is not a sentence I ever thought I'd say about my father. When we returned to Sydney, as we were leaving the plane, he looked at me and made a zipper motion across his mouth. Message received, never to be spoken about again. Years passed. I made many more trips to Thailand, often as a tour leader, taking groups across places like Thailand, Bali, and the Philippines. Eventually, I was preparing for another trip, leading a group from Melbourne on an orchid tour. Then I got the call. My dad had suffered a massive heart attack. At the hospital, I was told he likely wouldn't make it through the night. Perfect timing. Yes, that's honestly what went through my head, and it's not my finest moment. I was torn between family and responsibility, and I didn't know what to do. I went into intensive care and I sat beside him. We spoke briefly, and then, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I said this: "Dad, you need to hang on until I get back from Thailand. I can't let this group down." He said he'd try. I told him trying wasn't enough. He had to do it. Then, just to really seal the deal, I added one more thing. I told him I was going to look up that girl from Chiang Mai. Complete nonsense, by the way, but it gave him something to think about. The next day, the doctor pulled me aside and said something I will never forget. "This is like something out of the Bible. Remember Lazarus?" my father had made a sudden recovery. He was no longer in danger. Call it luck, stubbornness, or the fear of being forgotten by a woman in Chiang Mai. Whatever it was, it worked. He lived another 5 years. And yes, he kept asking about that girl. And yes, I kept lying. Now, I really enjoyed reading out this story, and this guy probably enjoyed writing it out too. Imagine taking your father over to Thailand and imagine what he would be getting up to. If anybody is watching or listening, have you taken your father to Thailand and what did they get up to? Let us know either in the comments or send an email to thaitalkwithdan@gmail.com and we will share it on the channel. Apart from that, guys, keep your stories rolling in, keep emailing them across, and I'll keep sharing them. Take it easy, look after yourselves, and ciao for now. Bye bye.